r/ProRevenge.
How my grandpa became the owner of a gas station/garage. My family immigrated America in the 1880s and settled in Nebraska. We were farmers for the first 80 years or so, but back in the 1960s my great-grandma decided she was going to sell the entire farm before she died and simply give her sons 1/3 of money for inheritance when she passed. She had 3 sons. In 1969 my great-grandma passed, and her 3 sons inherited the money she had earned from selling the farm. My grandpa decided he would basically let that money sit until after he retired from the military. In 1971 he deployed to Vietnam for his second and final deployment. At the end of his deployment he returned to Nebraska and retired after 22 years in the service. Now he had an old Chevy truck at the time and was in the process of building a concrete business with the money he had gotten from his inheritance. Well, during this time, his truck engine blew up. My grandpa was busy at the time and he didn't want to fool with the truck cause he was busy. So he bought himself the engine he wanted to replace it with, which was an upgrade, and he went down to the only garage in town and asked them if they'd be willing to put the engine in the truck. They agreed on a price, and told him to come back in a week or so. A week later my grandpa comes back and picks up the truck. He admits he felt like a fool for not double-checking the work, but assumed since this was the son of his friend that the son would do right by him. This was a small town. Well, my grandpa opens up the concrete business, and he's busy, and it comes time for his first oil change. This is about 4 months after he got the truck back. He's doing the oil change and he notices that the engine he bought isn't the engine in his truck. It's a smaller engine. This obviously pisses him off to high heaven, as my grandma liked to say. So he storms on down to the garage and talks to shop. Earl was the owner. Earl comes out and denies any wrongdoing. Says he did as he was told, and it shouldn't have taken him 4 months to bring the issue up. My grandpa tells Earl he needs to do what's right. Earl refuses. It's important to note, this is a small town. Written contracts, and so forth really isn't a thing. Your worth is your word. My grandpa tells Earl he's going to get him for this. Earl laughs and tells him to leave his shop. My grandpa goes down to the county and requests the record for who owns the gas station. Turns out it's an old family friend named Harold. My grandpa stops by Harold's house and starts inquiring about the business deal Harold has with Earl. Harold says well, Earl rents the gas station/garage from him. My grandpa asks Harold how is everything going, and Harold confides that Earl hasn't paid his rent in 2 months. My grandpa asks if you have a written lease with Earl. To which Harold goes, nah, I sure don't. My grandpa then asks what if I bought the gas station/garage from you. Harold isn't completely on board with the idea, but my grandpa makes a strong point. Earl isn't paying his rent, Harold doesn't seem like he has much interest in being a landlord anymore, and my grandpa has the cash to buy the place outright. Harold, sensing something is up, asks my grandpa, did Earl do something to you? You seem awfully interested in this garage, ain't you busy with that concrete business of yours? And my grandpa fills Harold in on the story. My grandpa also mentions that he has a son, my father, who needs something to do, and he'd be happy to buy the whole building from Harold for a fair price, and what happens after that is his business. Also, it's important to note, when Harold decided to rent this business to Earl, in that deal went all the equipment and tools that Harold had acquired over the years, so those belonged to the building. Harold and my grandpa came to a number that they both agreed on. A few days later my grandpa paid Harold in cash, in full, for the business. The paperwork is done and my grandpa is now the proud owner of a gas station and mechanic shop. Now my grandpa senses that Earl ain't going to be too pleased when my grandpa fires Earl, so for extra good measure my grandpa calls up the local sheriff, who is a high school friend, and asks the sheriff to come with him to break the news to Earl. So my grandpa and the sheriff go down to Earl's now former business and they walk in, and before my grandpa can even say hello, Earl says, now I told you, I didn't cheat you. My grandpa smiles and says, I'm not here about my truck, I'm here to fire you. Earl, with a look of confusion on his face, asks, you can't fire me. I own this business. My grandpa shows him the title and says, I'm now the owner of this building, to which Earl fires back, but I got a deal with Harold. And the sheriff speaks up, you do? Do you have a lease? Well, no, Earl says, to which the sheriff smiles and says, in that case, "You're going need to take your stuff and leave." Earl is fuming pissed, grabs his toolbox and storms out. My grandpa ended up hiring the mechanic that would occasionally work on his trucks at his concrete business. He had my aunt and grandma run the gas station full time and my dad would work there after school. We owned that garage for 25 years before my grandpa sold it to someone else.
A response to the post.
I live in a SMLL town and you can't deal dirty like that with people, especially locals. That kind of information will spread like wildfire.
A response to this comment.
Bad gas travels fast in a small town.
A response to the post.
Never mess with ordinary looking people, you never know how much money they might have to ruin you with.
OP's response to this comment.
Funny enough, I don't recall my grandpa buying power being a secret. By this point in his life he owned a couple rental properties plus his own home. And he paid for the concrete business in cash. But then again, I'm family, so I probably know more than someone who isn't. A few years later he actually ended up buying the local bar/restaurant, but there isn't a good story behind that.
A response to the post.
Sounds kinda like how Sam Walton ended up owning a bank. Supposedly he would visit his stores dressed in coveralls and driving his old truck, and wander around seeing if people were doing their jobs. He overheard an employee complaining that the bank wouldn't give his employees loans. He went into the bank, and asked for a loan application, even used his real name. If the loan manager had looked, he would have seen Sam was worth a couple $1 million. Instead, the loan manager denied his loan. Supposedly he called his lawyers, bought the bank, and showed up again in his nice car and a suit, and asked for the loan manager and fired him. Then found the employee at his store and told her to go apply again. I heard this from a guy who grew up in Bentonville.
A response to the post.
So, did Grandpa find the motor he bought?
OP's response to this comment.
He did not. He suspects Earl sold it. Earl was apparently behind on a bunch of bills.